How can a single week change the destiny of a nation? Burkina Faso, once a name barely whispered outside the borders of West Africa, suddenly found itself etched into the headlines of global news. For years, this small, landlocked nation lived under a shadow of relentless violence. Militants swept across the Sahel like an unending storm, torching villages, ambushing convoys, and leaving behind a trail of despair. The people, once proud farmers, herders, and traders, were now fugitives in their own homeland. Every week carried a new tragedy. One village would awaken to the crackle of gunfire. Another would vanish overnight, its houses smoldering, its people scattered into the wilderness. Mothers clutched their children tightly as they fled into the bush, while fathers stared helplessly at the horizon, wondering if tomorrow would bring safety or another funeral. By 2022, nearly 2 million Burkinabe had been displaced, forced to leave behind not only their homes but the graves of their ancestors, the fields they had tended for generations, and the rhythm of daily life that once gave them dignity. Schools closed, markets emptied, and entire regions became ungoverned wastelands, ruled only by fear. The question on every lip was haunting in its simplicity: who will protect us? In Ouagadougou, the capital city, the government's promises rang hollow. Soldiers on the front lines complained of being under-equipped and outnumbered, fighting against an invisible enemy who struck without warning. Villagers begged for protection, but reinforcements often came too late, or never at all. Trust in the leadership eroded like sand in the wind. And then came the week that would change everything. It was late September 2022. In the corridors of power, whispers grew louder. A young officer, little known to the world, was about to step forward. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. At just 34 years old, he carried neither the scars of a long political career nor the weariness of a seasoned general. He was a soldier of the soil, shaped by the same battles that had scarred his nation. To his comrades, he was a man of action, unwilling to accept defeat. To his people, he was still a mystery. But why him? Why now? The answer lay in the desperation of a nation pushed to the brink. For years, Burkina Faso had seen one leader after another make bold declarations, only to falter when the weight of insurgency pressed harder. The people were tired of speeches. They wanted resistance. They wanted hope. And in Traoré, they saw not just another officer in uniform, but perhaps the embodiment of a turning point. Imagine a small rural community on the northern frontier, a cluster of mud brick houses, children playing barefoot in the dust, women carrying water jars on their heads. At night, this village became a prison of fear. Families extinguished their fires early, plunging themselves into darkness, afraid that the glow of a single candle might betray their location. Every bark of a dog, every rustle of wind in the grass could be the signal of an approaching attack. And as dawn broke, the villagers would whisper the same question: how long before we are next? This was the Burkina Faso Traoré inherited. A nation suspended between survival and collapse, its heart beating with both defiance and despair. And yet, history teaches us that such moments, when all seems lost, are the very soil in which revolutions take root. Could this young captain ignite a flame where others had only offered ashes? Could he turn fear into resistance and despair into determination? The world had seen military coups before in Africa. Many, in fact. Some promised salvation, only to become mirrors of the same failures they sought to erase. Others descended into brutal regimes, silencing dissent with iron fists. Was Traoré destined to join this long line of strongmen? Or was he, as his supporters believed, the man who would break the cycle and give Burkina Faso a new path? The streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with rumors. Soldiers shifted loyalties, and foreign powers watched closely, calculating how this new leader might alter the fragile balance of the Sahel. For ordinary Burkinabe, however, the calculus was simple. Will this man finally protect us from the terror at our door? A single week, a single decision, a single man. These were the fragile threads on which the future of a nation now rested. And so, as the sun set on September 30th, 2022, a question hung heavy in the air. Was this the beginning of yet another cycle of broken promises, or the spark that would set Burkina Faso ablaze with resistance? The answer would not be long in coming. In wars, some leaders play it safe. Others take risks that rewrite history. That was the choice before Captain Ibrahim Traoré. When he seized power in 2022, Burkina Faso was already drowning in fear. Villages burned, highways became death traps, and militants tightened their grip on vast stretches of land. Previous leaders had promised protection, but their strategy was always the same: build defensive posts, guard the cities, and wait for the enemy to strike. It was a strategy of reaction, not of victory, and time after time, it had failed. But Traoré was not a man of waiting. He believed that in war, hesitation was just another word for surrender. His doctrine was simple, brutal, and almost reckless. Take the fight to the enemy before they bring it to you. It sounded heroic, but could it actually work? Intelligence reports had identified 5 major militant strongholds scattered across the north. These were not makeshift camps hidden in the bush. They were fortified sanctuaries, bristling with weapons, fighters, and supplies. From these bases, raids were launched like clockwork, each attack pushing Burkina Faso closer to collapse. Previous governments had tried to dislodge them. They sent columns of soldiers, backed by armored vehicles, into the unforgiving Sahel. But the operations ended the same way: ambushes, confusion, and retreats. Survivors came back bloodied and demoralized, whispering of an enemy that melted into the desert like ghosts. Now Traoré stood at the same crossroads. Would he repeat the cautious defensive playbook, or gamble everything on an offensive that seemed impossible? Picture the scene: a dimly lit room, somewhere in Ouagadougou. Around a battered wooden table sat his most trusted commanders. On the dew surface lay a large map of Burkina Faso's northern frontier, edges frayed from constant use. Red circles marked the 5 enemy bases, each one a beating heart of insurgency. Traoré leaned over, his hand casting a shadow across the map. His voice, calm but unwavering, broke the silence. We strike them all, one after another. No pause, no retreat. The room fell quiet. Some officers shifted nervously. They had seen what happened when such operations failed. But there was also something in Traoré's tone, a certainty, a refusal to accept the inevitability of defeat that silenced their doubts. Imagine the tension in that room. A nation's pride, already battered, was now tied to a single, audacious plan. If they succeeded, Burkina Faso would rise from humiliation. If they failed, it would not just be a military defeat. It would be national disgrace, a confirmation that their army was powerless, their state hollow. This was not just boldness. It was desperation wrapped in courage. For Traoré, the stakes were personal. He was not just a soldier anymore. He was a head of state whose legitimacy rested on his promise to fight back. If he hesitated, he would be branded as just another uniformed pretender in the long line of African coups. But if he struck decisively, if he brought the battle to the militants' doorstep, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could prove that Burkina Faso would not die quietly. And so the gamble began. Night fell across the Sahel, but in secret outposts, orders moved swiftly. Columns of soldiers readied their weapons. Trucks rumbled onto dirt tracks. The first wave would strike before dawn, hitting the enemy while they still slept. No one expected mercy. The militants were confident. They had watched past governments fail, and they believed this new captain would fold the same way. But Traoré's strategy was different. Instead of attacking one base and retreating to lick his wounds, he planned something unprecedented: to Strike all 5 strongholds in quick succession, leaving the enemy no time to recover, no safe haven to retreat to. Can you imagine the pressure? Each operation would be a race against time. Each success would fuel the next attack. Each failure would unravel the entire campaign. Soldiers knew they were not fighting for territory alone. They were fighting for the very soul of their country. The desert wind carried whispers of war. Villages that had long suffered in silence heard distant echoes of gunfire, not as raids against them, but as battles waged on behalf of their survival. For the first time in years, fear began to mingle with something unfamiliar, hope. But still, the question loomed like a shadow. Could Traoré's daring plan actually succeed where so many before had failed? Or would his gamble plunge Burkina Faso into an even deeper abyss? 5 circles on a map, 5 bastions of terror, 5 battles that would decide the future. And as the first shots rang out in the darkness, the world held its breath. Could they hold on to that independence in the face of global pressure, militant revenge, and the weight of history itself? The answer would not be decided in foreign capitals, but in the villages and battlefields of the Sahel, 5 bases destroyed. But was this a victory, or the opening of a bigger war? For one electrifying week, Burkina Faso felt the weight of history shift. The impossible had happened. 5 militant strongholds reduced to ruins, their banners torn down, their weapons abandoned in the dust. Soldiers marched back into towns as heroes. Villagers who had spent years trembling at night now welcomed them with tears, songs, and prayers. But beneath the celebrations, a question lingered like smoke after a fire. Was this truly the dawn of freedom, or only a pause before the next storm? In the capital, Ouagadougou, people cheered Ibrahim Traoré's name. At only 34 years old, he had become the youngest leader in the world, a captain who dared to gamble against fate and won. His picture appeared on murals, painted with slogans of hope. In cafes, in markets, in schools, the same phrase was repeated. At last, we are fighting back. Yet Traoré knew better than anyone that victory was never final. The militants had lost their strongholds, but they had not vanished. They were slipping into the wilderness, regrouping in shadowy camps, whispering oaths of revenge. Every victory carried the seeds of the next battle. The war was not over, it was merely changing shape. Imagine a displaced mother, Mariam, who had spent months in a crowded refugee camp after her village was burned to the ground. When news came that the militants had been driven out, she returned home with her children. The path back was lined with memories of terror, the charred remains of huts, the abandoned fields where weeds had swallowed crops. Yet when she stepped into her village square, she saw something new. Soldiers patrolled the roads. The flag of Burkina Faso fluttered over what had once been a militant base. For the first time in years, Mariam allowed herself to hope, but hope is fragile. She also knew that militants had a way of returning, like shadows at dusk. As she rebuilt her home, with trembling hands, she asked the question every mother whispered to herself: will they come back? This was the paradox Traoré now faced. On the one hand, he had given his people something they had not felt in years: dignity, pride, belief. On the other, he had drawn a red line that could not be erased. By striking so boldly, he had declared war not only on militants, but on the entire system of terror that had thrived in the Sahel. And that system would not collapse quietly. Could Burkina Faso sustain the momentum? Could its weary soldiers keep pushing forward, fighting an enemy that melted into the desert and struck when least expected? The pressure was enormous, and all of it rested on the shoulders of one man. Traoré was no longer just a captain. He was the face of resistance, the symbol of a nation refusing to kneel. Every victory was credited to him, but every failure would be laid at his feet. History is filled with leaders who carried such burdens, men who became larger than life in the eyes of their people, but who also lived under the crushing weight of expectation. Some rose to greatness, others broke beneath it. Which path would Traoré walk? International observers watched closely. In Western capitals, officials muttered about short-term gains. Analysts predicted the militants would adapt, shift tactics, and bleed the Burkina Faso army through guerrilla warfare. Some even suggested Traoré's boldness might provoke a wider backlash, plunging the nation into a conflict it could not sustain. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, few cared for such distant voices. What mattered was that, for the first time in years, Burkina Faso had struck fear into those who had long terrorized them. The psychological shift was seismic. Militants who, once felt untouchable, now looked over their shoulders. Farmers who once abandoned their fields now returned to plow the soil, even if only cautiously. A nation that had lived in silence was beginning to sing again. Still, the line between freedom and illusion remained perilously thin. Was this the birth of a new chapter, or the prelude to a bloodier cycle of war? Traoré himself hinted at the uncertainty. In speeches, he celebrated victories, but warned his people not to grow complacent. He spoke of sacrifice, of the long road ahead. His words carried both hope and caution, as if he knew the fire he had lit could either warm the nation or consume it. The desert winds carried whispers of revenge. Militants were regrouping, plotting, preparing. The Burkina Faso army was proud but stretched thin. Villagers returned home, but always with eyes on the horizon. And in the heart of the nation, its young leader wrestled with the greatest question of all. Had he truly changed Burkina Faso's destiny, or had he only begun a war too great to finish? The celebration was real, the victories undeniable. But as the smoke cleared from those 5 destroyed bases, a darker truth lingered. The battle for Burkina Faso was far from over. And soon, the world would see whether this spark of resistance could survive the storm that was coming. Day by day, base by base, the impossible began to unfold. Burkina Faso had been told for years that militant strongholds were untouchable, that they were fortresses carved into the desert, impossible to root out. But now, under the command of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the unthinkable was about to happen. 5 bases, 5 fortresses of terror, and only days to bring them down. The campaign began with the rising sun of day 1. At dawn, columns of soldiers rolled northward, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the first base waited. The militants had grown arrogant, confident that the army would never dare strike so deep into their territory. But arrogance is a dangerous weakness. The clash was sudden, brutal. Gunfire rattled through the desert air, mixing with the roar of armored trucks. Soldiers advanced with a determination fueled by years of humiliation. By midday, smoke rose from the enemy camp. Militants fled into the wilderness, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and the shattered illusion of invincibility. As soldiers raised the Burkina Faso flag above the captured stronghold, villagers emerged from hiding. Some wept, others clapped their hands in disbelief. For the first time in years, they were not running from fire. They were watching it consume their oppressors. But this was just the beginning. Day 2 brought no rest. Soldiers pushed onward, striking at the second base before militants could regroup. This camp was larger, fortified with trenches and heavy guns. Yet Traoré's doctrine was relentless. Strike fast, strike hard, never let the enemy breathe. The battle raged from morning into afternoon, dust clouds rising like storms as bullets cut through the desert heat. When silence finally returned, another flag rose against the sky. Soldiers, dirt-streaked and exhausted, stood tall as villagers, crowded around them, offering water, bread, even tears of gratitude. Old men bowed in respect, Children clapped and shouted. Hope, once a faint whisper, was becoming a roar. Still, the danger grew with each victory. The militants realized these attacks were not isolated. Someone was dismantling their empire piece by piece. Panic spread through their ranks. They had believed themselves untouchable. Now, they saw their fortresses collapsing in rapid succession. Could they truly be hunted down, base after base? On day 3, the impossible continued. Another camp, another battle, another victory. This time, the fight was at night. Flames lit up the darkness as soldiers stormed through the compound. Villagers hidden in the hills watched the sky glow red, their prayers carried on the wind. When dawn broke, the smoke cleared to reveal another stronghold reduced to ashes. Traoré's gamble was working. The militants were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. By day 4, fear was etched on both sides. Soldiers knew the mission had grown harder. Every mile deeper into enemy territory was a step into uncertainty. Supplies ran thin. Fatigue gnawed at their strength. Yet the momentum was unstoppable. The 4th base fell after hours of ferocious combat. Militants who had once laughed at the thought of defeat now abandoned their weapons and fled. It was not just a military victory, it was psychological warfare at its peak. For years, insurgents had ruled by fear. Now, they tasted it themselves. And then came day 5, the final base, the largest, the most feared. This was the heart of their network, the command center from which terror had spread across Burkina Faso. Everyone knew that taking this stronghold would not only cripple the militants but break their spirit entirely. The battle was fierce, the kind that sears itself into memory. Gunfire thundered across the desert, mortars shook the ground, and smoke choked the sky. Yet through it all, the Burkinabe soldiers pressed forward. Inch by inch, yard by yard, they reclaimed their land. At last, silence fell. Soldiers, dust-covered, exhausted but unbroken, stood where militants had once commanded fear. Slowly, carefully, the national flag was raised. Cloth fluttered against the wind, red and green catching. The first rays of sunset. For those watching, it was not just a flag. It was a symbol of rebirth, a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer bow. Imagine the scene. Villagers pouring from the shadows, women ululating, children cheering, elders dropping to their knees in prayer. The desert, once a place of despair, echoed with cries of joy. In just 5 days, 5 bases had fallen. What once seemed impossible had become reality. The militants, who had thought themselves untouchable, were suddenly vulnerable. Their empire of fear was crumbling before their eyes. But victory carried its own weight. Could Traoré sustain this momentum? Could he turn these stunning victories into a lasting peace? Or would the militants regroup, returning with vengeance? The week of fire had ended. But the war for Burkina Faso's future was only beginning. When a small country stands up, the whole world takes notice. For decades, Burkina Faso was seen as a fragile state, too poor, too small, too dependent to chart its own path in a world dominated by giants. Western capitals treated it as a patient in need of constant supervision, a battlefield that could not survive without foreign troops, foreign aid, and foreign dictates. But then came the shockwave of 2022 and the victories that followed. Suddenly, the narrative was changing, and the world was forced to pay attention. In Paris, officials watched the reports with disbelief. French intelligence had long argued that without France's military umbrella, the Sahel would collapse into chaos. And yet here was Burkina Faso, a country that had expelled French forces, scoring victory after victory against the very militants France had failed to eliminate during years of Operation Barkhane. The images of Burkinabe soldiers raising their flag over captured strongholds did more than stir pride at home. They sent tremors through European chancelleries. Had the old power structures begun to crack? In Washington, the tone was cautious. Analysts spoke of temporary success and warned against overconfidence, but beneath their measured words lay a deeper unease. If Burkina Faso proved that an African army could defend itself without NATO logistics or foreign boots on the ground, what would that mean for the entire balance of influence across West Africa? Would others follow? Would Western leverage, painstakingly, built over decades, begin to slip away? And indeed, the echoes were already spreading. In Mali, where resentment toward foreign troops had been simmering for years, Traoré's victories were celebrated almost as if they were their own. The message was clear. If Burkina Faso could defy the odds, so could Mali. Across Niger, where political winds were shifting, soldiers and civilians alike whispered of the Burkina campaign as proof that liberation did not require permission from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. Even in remote villages scattered along the Sahel, where radios crackled with half-heard broadcasts, people spoke the same words. They did it themselves. But was this truly independence, or the beginning of isolation? For while African neighbors offered cautious praise, Western partners grew wary. Some governments quietly cut aid. International organizations muttered about human rights concerns and democratic norms. Critics accused Traoré of gambling with his people's future, replacing dependence on foreign troops with the uncertainty of going it alone. Supporters, however, argued that dignity was worth the risk, that only by standing without crutches could Burkina Faso ever learn to walk on its own. It was a battle of symbols as much as soldiers. For decades, Africa had been cast in the role of the dependent child, always needing rescuers, always portrayed as too weak to stand. Operation Barkhane itself had been presented as a noble mission. Thousands of French troops deployed across the Sahel, tasked with stabilizing the region. But after nearly a decade, what remained? Militants were stronger than ever. Civilian deaths had multiplied, and trust between locals and foreign soldiers had withered. To many Burkinabe, Barkhane became not a shield, but a reminder that sovereignty had been outsourced. Traoré's victories broke that script. The footage of Burkinabe soldiers reclaiming their soil carried more weight than any speech. It was not just about guns or strategy. It was about reclaiming ownership of destiny. Where foreign interventions had left frustration and dependency, this new campaign radiated something far more potent: self-belief. Yet every act of defiance comes with a price. Would the West punish Burkina Faso with sanctions, cutting off trade and aid? Would the militants, backed by shadowy networks, strike harder to prove that this moment of triumph was only temporary? Or would this spark a wider fire across the Sahel, igniting a wave of defiance that no foreign power could contain? Consider this. In the past, when small nations challenged great empires, their victories were not always measured in territory but in symbolism. Vietnam in the 20th century, Algeria before that. Each stood as proof that power is not always decided by size but by will. Could Burkina Faso now be writing its own chapter in that same book of resistance? For ordinary Burkinabe, these questions mattered less than the feeling that, for once, the world was looking at them not as victims, but as actors. The cheers in the streets, the prayers whispered in village mosques, the songs of celebration, carried by radio, all spoke to the same truth. Something had shifted. And so, the world watched. Some with admiration, others with suspicion, many with unease. A small country had stood up. But what would it cost to keep standing? Because if Burkina Faso had declared to the world that Africans could defend themselves, the next challenge loomed even larger.